Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're plunging into excerpts from a really fascinating book, one that takes a pretty bold look at the biggest questions facing us right now here in the 21st century.
That's right. We've got this stack of notes and key passages from a text that dives headfirst into the huge shifts happening all around us. From the future being shaped by tech to the basic stories we tell ourselves to make sense of everything.
And our mission today is to try and unpack some of the most compelling ideas in this material. We'll be your guides through what feels like a challenging but honestly an incredibly insightful landscape. It's about getting to grips with where we are now and maybe where we're headed.
It definitely offers some sharp perspectives, makes you rethink some familiar assumptions for sure.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. The material kicks off with this really striking idea about the shifting ground of the stories we live by, the sort of grand narratives humanity uses. What's the trajectory it lays out?
It suggests this fascinating, almost like a compression of our worldview. Back in, say, 1938, the author argues there was this rich mix of competing ideologies, lots of different stories about how the world worked and where it was going, multiple powerful systems all vying for dominance.
Like a real marketplace of ideas, or maybe a battleground of ideas.
Precisely. Then by 1968, that had narrowed quite dramatically, maybe down to just two major contenders, you could say. Fast forward to 1998, and it felt like, well, one dominant global narrative had pretty much taken over.
And the notes say that by 2018, we've effectively moved to zero. Like no single overarching story that everyone agrees on to guide us.
Yeah, zero. And this sudden lack of a clear narrative, it creates a kind of vacuum. The material suggests this is particularly disorienting for groups who felt, comfortable under the previous dominant story. Liberal elites are mentioned as an example. They had this expectation of a sort of happy ending to history, a predictable path forward.
And when history didn't follow the script, it caused shock, even panic. It sounds like the source describes it as feeling like a rush towards Armageddon because the familiar story, the expected path, just disappeared.
That's the idea. The inability to fit events into the old, comfortable framework leads to this kind of almost apocalyptic thinking. But the text makes a really crucial distinction here. It suggests a more insightful response than just panicking.
You mean the shift from panic to perplexity?
Exactly that. Panic, the author suggests, is actually a form of arrogance. It comes from the certainty, maybe even a smug certainty, that you know exactly where things are going, usually straight downhill.
So thinking you know the world's ending is actually less humble than admitting you just don't understand it.
That's the core point. Perplexity is framed as more humble and because of that, more insightful. Instead of being certain of doom, you admit, hold on, I don't actually understand what's happening here.
Right. Admitting you don't know clears the way to actually try and figure things out instead of just reacting based on an old story that's falling apart.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's connect this shifting ground, these narrative changes, to the impact of technology. How does the source link this to something like, say, 21st century populism?
It puts forward a really interesting idea about what might be driving revolts like Brexit or the rise of Trump support. Those are used as examples in the text. Traditionally, revolutions were often about fighting exploitation. Think 19th century socialists, the Russian Revolution. Those movements were driven by people absolutely vital to the economy, factory workers, peasants, but who lacked political power. They wanted to turn their economic importance into political clout.
They were exploited, definitely, but they were needed.
Precisely. But the argument here is that in some recent populist movements, support often came from people who did have political power, through voting, but they feared losing their economic value. Their fear wasn't just about being exploited by some elite, but about becoming economically irrelevant, the dread of just not being needed anymore by that elite or by the economy itself.
And the text frames fighting irrelevance as much harder than fighting exploitation.
Oh, significantly harder. You can organize, you can protest, you can even revolt against someone who exploits you but still relies on your labor. It's way, way harder to fight someone who simply doesn't need you or the skills you have anymore.
That fear of becoming irrelevant, it ties straight into those long-standing worries about automation and job loss, right? Which have been around since the Luddites in the 19th century. But why does this source suggest that this time might be different?
It points to the nature of human abilities. For most of history, machines mainly replaced physical labor. Steam engines, mechanical looms. Humans still had this unique edge when it came to cognitive tasks. Thinking, planning, analyzing.
But now, with machine learning and AI, That's changing fast.
Exactly. AI is getting better and better at cognitive tasks, crunching data, helping with diagnoses, writing code, recognizing patterns, even driving cars. This is a new frontier for automation, and it impacts different kinds of jobs.
So it's not just robots on an assembly line anymore. It could be algorithms processing information in an office.
Partly, yeah. The material suggests AI probably won't replace entire industries overnight. But jobs that involve narrow, routine activities, whether cognitive or physical, seem most vulnerable. On the other hand, jobs needing broad skills, flexibility for unexpected situations, and especially emotional intelligence and complex motor skills, those are much harder for current AI to replicate.
Like in healthcare, maybe. But perhaps not the roles you'd immediately think of.
Right. A doctor analyzing huge amounts of medical data for a diagnosis. Parts of that might be augmented or even replaced by AI sooner than, say, a nurse giving an injection, changing a bandage, or comforting a distressed patient. Those things need fine motor skills and real emotional connection.
The messy, unpredictable, very human stuff.
Yes. And the care industry, generally looking after kids, the sick, the elderly, that's highlighted as a sector likely to stay strongly human. And with people living longer, care for the elderly is even projected as a major growth area for human jobs. Creativity is also mentioned as, well, at least a current hurdle for AI.
Okay, but beyond just job losses, the source talks about AI gaining a different kind of power, authority. Not through force, but because we increasingly, trust the algorithms more than ourselves.
It's a subtle thing, isn't it? We stop searching for information and we just Google it. We often outsource the judgment of what's reliable, or we follow GPS directions blindly, even when our own sense of direction or local knowledge screams otherwise.
That story about the tourists following their GPS into the Australian wilderness, that's a perfect, slightly scary example of that.
It really illustrates that loss of our own capacity through over-reliance. And the material pushes this further. It speculates about algorithms starting to manipulate our emotions directly. It uses this scenario of an algorithm creating a personalized music playlist, say, designed to guide someone through the stages of grief after a breakup.
Like starting with upbeat distraction, then angry music, then sad, then finally something hopeful.
Exactly that kind of thing. It's a form of emotional engineering, really. And the next logical step, the source warns, could be algorithms directly tampering with our emotions, maybe even our bodies, through biochemical means.
Wow. That brings us to a really unsettling projection in the material. The potential emergence of a useless class by, 2050. And it's not just about lacking jobs or education, but lacking the mental resilience to cope with this constant relentless change and disruption.
The 21st century does feel like it's generating this global stress epidemic, doesn't it? Jobs feel more volatile, the future more uncertain. Can human psychology actually adapt quickly enough and widely enough?
So maybe alongside thinking about job retraining, we need to focus just as much on large-scale ways to boost mental and emotional resilience. Things like therapy, maybe even drugs, or technologies like neurofeedback.
The material briefly touches on potential policy responses to this whole picture of automation and potential displacement. One option is trying to, well, prevent job loss, maybe by deliberately slowing down automation in certain areas.
A bit like how we have laws preventing a market for human organs. Even though it's technically feasible and maybe commercially viable, governments can choose to put the brakes on some technologies.
Exactly. Technology isn't destiny. But the source does frame that approach as tricky because you sacrifice the potential benefits of AI and robotics. Other possibilities mentioned are trying to create enough new jobs to offset the losses, or, and this is crucial, figuring out how to manage a society where maybe significant numbers of people are economically superfluous.
And the impact isn't even, right? Developing countries that rely on cheap labor for making things or running call centers, they could be hit particularly hard as AI, robots, and 3D printing make that cheap human labor less of an advantage.
Now, if you combine this rise of AI with advances in biotechnology, the stakes get even higher. The source raises this profound risk of, well, biological inequality.
You mean where the super rich could use their wealth not just for yachts and mansions, but to actually buy life extension or cognitive enhancements or physical upgrades for themselves and their kids?
Historically, aristocracies believed they were inherently superior, but it was based on social status, laws, maybe better nutrition, not actual biological difference. By 2100, the material suggests this could change fundamentally.
Creating a real, maybe almost unbridgeable biological gap between enhanced elites and the rest of humanity.
Yes. Imagine if the wealthiest 1% can use their money to become genuinely more beautiful, more creative, more intelligent, healthier through bioenhancements, and then use those superior abilities to make even more money, which then buys them even better enhancements. You could create this feedback loop that makes today's wealth gap look tiny.
The idea that by 2100, the richest 1% might own not just most of the world's wealth, but also most of its beauty, creativity, and health, that's properly chilling.
It is a stark projection, and it brings us right back to what it means to be human in this rapidly changing world, especially our deep need for meaning, for narrative. The source reiterates that fundamental idea. Human success comes from cooperating on a massive scale, and that cooperation runs on our belief in shared fictions.
Fictions like nations, or economic systems like capitalism, or religious stories.
Exactly. And the material points out that artists, poets, painters, musicians, filmmakers are just as vital to this cooperation as soldiers or engineers. They help create, reinforce, and sometimes challenge these shared fictions. Hollywood, for instance, is mentioned as playing a huge role in reinforcing the capitalist fiction that buying things makes you happy.
And science fiction specifically is highlighted as being incredibly important right now because it's grappling directly with these huge technological and biological shifts we've been talking about.
Yet the source also offers a bit of a critique of a lot of contemporary sci-fi. It suggests many films are actually just allegories for older fears, maybe fears we don't want to acknowledge, rather than truly exploring what AI might mean.
Like the example given for Ex Machina,
Yeah.
that it might be less about AI itself and more about, say, men's anxieties about intelligent, liberated women, given the way the characters are gendered.
That's the argument presented, yeah. Why would a non-biological AI even have a gender? It suggests the film might be projecting human social issues onto the technology rather than exploring the tech itself.
What about films like The Matrix or The Truman Show? They seem to tackle singular reality head-on.
They're seen as good films, certainly influential, but maybe flawed because they operate on this assumption that there's an authentic self or an authentic reality outside the manipulation. They offer a pretty conventional heroic story. The hero breaks free from the illusion, finds the real truth.
But Inside Out, the Pixar movie about emotions, that's presented as potentially much more profound.
Yes, the argument in the material is that Inside Out, may be hidden a bit by being a comedy with a happy ending, actually conveys a really radical neurological message. It suggests our so-called authentic self might just be a narrative created by our own biochemical algorithms. Our emotions shown as little characters pulling levers based on internal processes we don't consciously direct.
So the self isn't some pure soul trying to escape the machine. The self is the machine, creating its own story.
That's the provocative idea. And then there's Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, written way back in 1931, which the source calls astonishingly prophetic.
Right, imagining that future built on peace, prosperity, consumerism, casual sex, and drugs like soma, where happiness is the ultimate goal.
The core idea in Huxley's book, as the source highlights it, is that humans are basically biochemical algorithms, and science and technology can hack and manipulate these algorithms to produce happiness.
There's that really striking quote from the world controller, Mustafa Mond, isn't there, about civilization not needing nobility or heroism because they're just signs of inefficiency.
Yes, that a well-run society eliminates the need for struggle or loyalty or resistance. If anything unpleasant pops up, there's soma, which he calls Christianity without tears. And the response from the character called the Savage is so simple but powerful. But I like the tears, or rather, but tears are necessary.
That really resonates with this fundamental human search for meaning, doesn't it? People seem to crave a story, a narrative that explains reality and gives them a place in some larger context, connects them to something bigger than just themselves.
It's like that ancient idea of a cosmic cycle and individual dharma, or function, that you find in texts like the Bhagavad Gita. The story of Prince Arjuna doubting his duty to fight, and Krishna teaching him that understanding life's meaning involves understanding your unique role and, well, fulfilling it.
And Disney's The Lion King is essentially that same ancient story retold for us today, right? Simba finding his meaning by accepting his dharma, his role as king within the circle of life.
It's a powerful, enduring narrative structure. However, the source does critique many modern narratives, especially nationalism, for being too narrow-minded. Focusing intensely on just one small group, one patch of land, ignoring the vastness of deep history or the cosmos. Even Simba's focus purely on his kingdom, while necessary for the plot, is presented as also limited in that bigger picture.
So what makes a story successful in this sense, according to the material?
It doesn't actually need to explain the ultimate meaning of everything. The source suggests successful stories are often quite open-ended. It mentions that anecdote about the person explaining the world rests on a giant turtle, and when asked what the turtle stands on, just says, "Don't worry about that, it's turtles all the way down." The story works, provides structure, without needing some absolute foundation.
And the material brings up sacrifice as maybe the most powerful ritual for strengthening our belief in these fictions.
Because suffering is undeniably real, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you suffer for a belief, whether you're fasting for God or you lose a leg fighting for your nation, or even just making smaller sacrifices like choosing local pasta over tastier foreign stuff out of principle, the tangible reality of that suffering makes the intangible fiction feel much more real.
Even though, logically, suffering for a belief doesn't actually make the belief true.
No, it's a logical fallacy, but a powerful psychological tool. The example is given of, say, religious political parties imposing rules that cause inconvenience or even suffering, preventing family visits on a holy day, blocking certain student activities. The source interprets this, perhaps controversially, as demonstrating and strengthening their own belief in their narrative, the logic being they wouldn't cause real harm unless they truly believed in the good reason behind it, which is their fiction.
And that shared sacrifice also creates incredibly strong bonds within the group, differentiating them from outsiders.
Yes, definitely. Though even sacrifice doesn't always equate to absolute certainty. There's that interesting anecdote mentioned about the crusader who was eager to die in battle to get straight to paradise, but his comrades physically held him back. It shows that even with the promise of eternal reward, belief isn't always this pure, unquestioning conviction.
Which brings us to how we view doubt. For centuries, faith was seen as the virtue and doubt was the sin. But modern society has largely flipped that script, hasn't it?
Yes, often seeing unquestioning faith as potentially a form of mental slavery, and doubt, or at least questioning, as essential for freedom and progress. Modern liberal societies are fundamentally built on questioning assumptions, rechecking evidence, exploring different paths.
You think of Galileo challenging church dogma, or Rosa Parks challenging segregation laws.
Exactly. It takes huge courage to fight obvious oppression. But the material argues it might take even more courage to admit ignorance, to say, "I don't know," and venture into the unknown. That fear of uncertainty can be really paralyzing.
And societies that are willing to admit what they don't know, to ask the hard questions, often end up being more adaptable, more prosperous, maybe even more peaceful than those demanding rigid loyalty to a single, unquestionable answer. Questions we can't answer are better than answers we can't question.
The source then goes on to outline some core secular values, which it sees as really foundational for navigating this complex modern world.
Like truth, but based on observation and evidence, not just dogma.
Yes. And compassion, stemming from recognizing that suffering is universal, which naturally leads to equality, because if suffering is universal, everyone's suffering matters equally, implying equal moral worth. Then there's freedom, the freedom to think, investigate, experiment without having to bow to some unquestionable authority. And finally, responsibility, because if there's no divine plan or external master pulling the strings, then we have to take responsibility for our choices and the state of the world.
And it's pointed out that these values aren't exclusively secular, right? Many religions share them too.
That's a key point. A secular society isn't necessarily anti-religious. It can fully embrace religious individuals as long as, when core values conflict, they prioritize these shared secular principles, like treating people equally regardless of faith, respecting free speech, abandoning discriminatory practices like caste systems. It's more about fostering critical thinking, compassion, and responsibility than denying God.
Although there is a counter-argument mentioned too, that maybe secularism sets the ethical bar a bit too high for actually governing large societies effectively.
Yeah, the idea that it's hard to govern, especially in emergencies like war or economic crises, based purely on nuanced, uncertain ideas. Sometimes situations seem to demand clear guidance, simple slogans, rallying cries, things that more dogmatic belief systems are often better at providing.
And we've seen secular movements, like Marxism, which started as a critique of religion, sometimes unfortunately morph into rigid dogmatic systems themselves.
All these points kind of feed into the challenges of navigating where we are now and where we're going. And maybe the biggest challenge highlighted is accepting this idea of the knowledge illusion.
The argument that our individual confidence in our own rationality is, well, largely misplaced,
Right.
that we actually know far less than we think, and modern society only functions because knowledge is distributed across many minds, creating this illusion that each of us understands more than we do.
Exactly. Democracy kind of rests on the idea that the voter knows best. Capitalism assumes the customer is always right. Liberal education encourages students to think for themselves. The source argues these are all built on somewhat flawed assumptions about the rational individual.
And power itself often distorts reality, doesn't it? People tend to tell those in charge what they want to hear, not necessarily the unvarnished truth.
Plus, the world is just so incredibly complex now. Our brains evolved for hunter-gatherer societies, dealing with immediate cause and effect. It's really hard for us to grasp the complex chains of causality in the modern global system. How can you feel directly responsible for, say, injustices happening on the other side of the world? Your comfortable life might unknowingly depend on supply chains involving child labor or environmental damage or animal exploitation, but the links are abstract, distant, distributed.
Making it incredibly difficult to trace clear lines of guilt or individual responsibility.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And in this interconnected, complex world, the material argues the supreme moral imperative actually shifts. It's not just about having good intentions anymore. It's the imperative to know, to make the effort to understand. Ignorance and indifference, maybe more than outright malice, are seen as major drivers of many modern historical crimes. Think of ordinary people in the 1930s choosing not to see what was happening, or individuals benefiting from colonial systems without fully grasping the harm. Moral certainty is really, really difficult without the clarity of hindsight in a world this complicated.
And globalization makes this even harder, but also more crucial, needing to understand the vastly different life experiences of others. Say, the experience of a black man facing police interaction versus the completely different struggles faced by, I don't know, a Chinese lesbian.
Another huge challenge the material points to for individuals is just the sheer pace of accelerated change. That traditional life model, you learn stuff, then you work for decades using that knowledge that's becoming obsolete because of rapid technological and social shifts, plus we're living longer.
Meaning, you might have to fundamentally reinvent yourself, maybe multiple times, during your working life. What you learned in your 20s could be totally irrelevant by your 40s or 50s.
And the current global education system, often described as this mass production, factory-like model, it's really struggling to prepare people for this future of constant adaptation and reinvention. And a universally viable alternative hasn't really emerged yet.
Which brings us to this final and maybe most profound warning from the material we looked at. This idea of a closing window.
Yeah, the concern that algorithms might soon make it incredibly difficult, perhaps even impossible, for people to observe and understand reality about themselves.
Because the algorithms could actually become better at predicting our desires, understanding our emotions, knowing our weak spots, better than we know ourselves.
That's the worry. They could essentially decide who we are, what we should know about ourselves. Maybe they'll offer us this personalized, comfortable, convenient, but ultimately manipulated fiction of who we are. The really chilling implication is that this current period, right now, might be humanity's last real chance to engage in that difficult, messy process of self-observation and self-understanding before algorithms basically take over that function for us, shaping our inner world just as much as our outer one.
Wow. That really was a whirlwind tour through some truly profound and pretty challenging ideas from this book.
It was. We've touched on the collapse of those big old stories and the disorientation that follows, the fear of economic irrelevance being driven by AI, the subtle but really pervasive rise of algorithmic authority over our choices, even our feelings, the unsettling potential for a future divided into biological castes, and that enduring human need for meaning and narrative, even when we know those narratives might be fictions.
It definitely forces you to confront how much of what we think of as reality is actually built on the stories we believe, and how rapidly these forces, especially technology like AI and biotech, are reshaping everything potentially, including our very selves, our ability to think independently, and maybe even feel genuinely.
Indeed. So, the question for you listening to this, as you navigate the complexities and the sheer uncertainty of the 21st century, how do you grapple with the absence of a single, simple, grand narrative? How do you figure out what's true and hold on to independent thought when algorithms are becoming so influential, offering these very tempting personalized fictions, maybe even about who you are?
Lots to think about. Keep observing, keep asking questions, and definitely keep diving deep into these vital ideas.